A terrible drought. It had not rained in over a year.
The rivers stopped flowing.
The water holes became deadly mud traps.
And the grass turned brown, dried up, and blew away.
The animals had to leave the area by ones,
Twos,
tens,
20s,
hundreds,
and thousands.
Soon all that were left were those who were too old or too weak to travel, and they were just waiting to die.
Now there was one exception, and that was a young lioness. And the reason she chose to stay behind was because she was pregnant. She was simply too big to travel.
Her plan was to deliver her cub, and when it was strong enough to walk beside her, they would both leave.
But as the days went on, it got harder and harder for her to find food to eat.
One morning she awoke, and she knew from the changes in her body that today would be the day her cub would be born, and she was very worried.
She was afraid she would not have the strength to deliver that cub.
So she went out looking for food. She listened as the wind blew past her ears.
And then she stopped, lifted her nose, and sniffed the air.
Ah, there was no doubt about it. Somewhere nearby was a herd of goats.
She walked over to a cliff that overlooked a small valley and peered down.
There, bubbling up, was a small spring.
Around that spring was a pond.
Around that pond, a small patch of grass.
And feeding on that grass was a herd of goats.
She knew all she had to do was catch one goat, and perhaps she and her cub could survive.
So with what little strength she had left in her body, she leapt off that cliff into the valley and landed with a splat.
All the goats fled in terror.
Now the goats returned a few hours later and discovered to their horror there in the middle of their beautiful, peaceful green valley now lay a dead lioness.
And beside the lioness was a newborn lion cub, and it was still alive.
The goats began to argue among themselves about what they should do with this cub. And finally, they agreed that they would just raise it as one of their own.
And so it was that the lion cub was passed from mother goat to mother goat, and it grew strong on that goat's milk.
But soon it grew too big, and that's when the mother goats began to push it away, and they started to teach him to eat the grass.
Things started to go terribly wrong for that little cub. He stopped growing.
His ribs started to show on both sides.
His fur began to fall out in patches.
And soon his feet began to crack open and bleed with every step he took.
Anyone could see that the cub was dying of starvation.
But those goats, they didn't say a word to him.
Now, by this time, the drought had ended. Rains had come at last.
Again, the rivers began to flow.
And the watering holes filled up with water.
And the grass grew tall and green.
The animals began to return to the area by ones,
twos,
tens,
20s,
hundreds,
and thousands.
And among those who returned was a magnificent lion.
And he decided that he was hungry and it was time for another meal.
So he listened as the wind blew past his ears.
And then he stopped and lifted his nose and sniffed the wind.
Ah, there was no doubt about it. Somewhere nearby was a herd of goats.
He raced to a cliff that overlooked a small valley and he peered down.
And there he saw a small spring bubbling up.
Around that spring was a pond.
Around that pond, a patch of grass.
And feeding on that grass was a herd of goats.
Ah, all he had to do was leap into that valley, and he would have himself a fine meal.
So he sprang off that cliff and landed in the valley.
And all the goats fled in terror.
He didn't care. He didn't have to move. He caught himself his dinner when he landed.
But when he lifted up his massive paw, instead of a goat, there was the scrawniest, sickliest looking lion cub he had ever seen. What are you doing here?
And the cub looked up at him with terror in his eyes. Bah!
Don't you talk to me like that, boy. You're a lion. Lions roar, roar.
But the cub just looked at him, shook his head, and went, "Goat!"
No. You're no goat. You're a lion. Come, I'll prove it. He pushed the cub over to that still pond and held his head over the still water.
And then he held his massive maned head next to the lion cub so the reflections were side by side in the pond.
Now, there's no denying you're a pretty pitiful specimen of a lion, but there's also no denying you look a lot more like me than you do those goats you've been living with. You are a lion.
But again, the cub just shook his head. "Goat!"
No. You're a lion. Come with me. And he snatched up the cub by the scruff of the neck, took him to a nearby cave, and dropped him in the entrance to the cave and said, "Don't move a muscle. I'll be right back."
That poor little cub was so terrified that he did exactly that. He froze right where the lion had dropped him.
A short while later, that lion returned with a freshly killed gazelle.
He dropped it in front of the cub, and then he began pulling off hunks of meat and eating them.
He took a small piece and held it out to the cub. "Here, eat this."
The cub just looked at him in horror and shook his head again and went, "Grass!"
No. Goats eat grass. Lions eat red meat. You're a lion. You must eat this meat. If you don't, you're gonna die.
But the cub just shook his head again. "Goat! Grass!"
The lion decided right then and there was no way he was going to have a dead lion cub on his paws. So he grabbed that cub, pried open its mouth, stuffed the meat in, and clamped it shut and held it.
Well, the cub resisted, but finally he gave up and swallowed.
Only then did the lion let go of the cub and step back.
That cub stared at that lion.
The lion stared back at the cub.
But after a few moments, the cub spoke again. "More?"
Sure. You can have all you want. Eat away.
And the cub ate the gazelle until he had his fill.
And only then did the lion finish his meal.
And with both their bellies filled, they then lay side by side in that cave, getting ready to take a nap.
Then the lion looked down at the cub and smiled. "Good. Today, you've had your very first lesson in being the lion that you're worthy to be."
And the little lion cub looked up sleepily and went, "Roar."
Thank you.